Hey, welcome back. We are going through the story, the speech that I give at the start of every one of these videos. I'll do it short in case you've heard one before. The story is an abridged Bible, meaning it's shorter, doesn't have every detail. It's, I don't know, a fifth of the length, maybe hard to say. It's got the entire Bible in it, though. It's reordered chronologically, and it meets a real need. And it's for people's first read through the Bible. So eventually, if you're a Christian for 80 years, you're going to read the Bible forwards and backwards many times over. But let's say, just pretend that you have never actually read the Old Testament or never read the Bible. You actually are better off starting with this book or one like it rather than the Bible for your first read. And that's weird. It's because there's things that take a lot of time to understand in the Bible, and you are in fact better off with the shorter version first. And so that's why I really like Zondervan's The Story. We're going through it as a small group. We're up to chapter 9. Chapter 9 is the shortest one in the book, so probably this video should be a little shorter today. Admittedly, I'll sneak in some things because it's a short chapter. But let's dive in. So verse of the day, I always throw out these verse of the days. It's actually Ruth 4:14, so it's the gold one there if you just kind of sneak down to the middle. Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. And so if you take this sentence out of context, praise be to the Lord who's not left you out a redeemer, it's kind of like talking about Jesus if you take it out of context. Now, the context is it's not talking about Jesus, it's talking about Boaz. But if you put a little more context in it here, Ruth, the story of Ruth, starting from chapter 1, this is like the end, chapter 4, is about a woman named Naomi, her husband Elimelech. They moved to Moab. The husband dies, the sons die. One of the sons marries Ruth before he dies, and Naomi becomes very angry. She has depression stages. She's in anger, and she insists on people calling her Mara, which means bitter, when her name Naomi meant sweet. So you can see how this crisis is affecting her at this point in the story, and then through grace. They are redeemed, is really what it comes down to. A lot of parallels there. And then at the end of the story, they say, Naomi has a son. Now, just to kind of back us up a little bit, this story is a short story, but you do have to understand the culture a little bit to understand the story. So the story, what was important to men, what was important to women at this time. So a big thing with Israel was your family line, like your clan within your tribe. And there are laws about how your family line can continue. And it's a patriarchal society. This is not God's ideal, but they do everything through the men. And so the problem here is this family line of Elimelech, where Naomi is the wife, has died out, right? So the husband, Elimelech, he's dead. His two boys, Naomi's sons, they all die. And as a result, their family line is no more, right? And so that is the worst possible thing that could happen to Naomi, right? And she does indeed get very bitter. And in our time today is like, well, just get remarried, right? But that's not how it worked then, right? Her family line has died, and she is in misery. In the middle of the story, she eventually realizes that there's a chance that through Ruth, their family line could be restored. So there was actually a law, because this was such a big problem, that if a husband died without having a male son, the brother would marry the wife and have a male son to continue their line. So the first son would be continuing their line, the line of Naomi, and then potentially after that, they could be her own sons. But that's what's going on here. And so the end of the verse says, Naomi has a son. It was obviously Ruth's son, but it's Naomi's line is now preserved. And that's what she really cared about. And so it's a story of blessing. So crisis that leads to blessing is what the story is all about. Before we dive into Ruth, this tangent got big with the small group. I thought I'd mention that Ruth is right after Judges in our Old Testament. And it's there because of Ruth 1:1, in the days when the judges ruled. And so chronologically, that's when it happened. The authors that organized the Old Testament, they were trying to put all the historical books together. They were trying to put them in chronological order. They moved things like Ruth into this spot. They obviously moved Esther, Nehemiah, and Chronicles into their chronological spots. But that was not how the Hebrew Bible was actually ordered. So the Hebrew Bible, also called the Tanakh, which is just an acronym for Torah, Nevim, Ketuvim, I'm sure I'm saying those words wrong, had 24 scrolls. The 12 prophets here, this was like one scroll, so this is actually one scroll here. Samuel was actually just one scroll. We just broke it up because it was long, right? And it's interesting to see the history and to like look into how did this happen? Like how do we get here? Which one's right? There's not really a right, but how did this happen? So let's back up. Well, Ruth is short. We'll get to Ruth. So when did all these books happen? And so the first books were obviously the Torah or the Pentateuch, the ones that we ascribe the authorship to Moses. He obviously put down the original information, but what we see is not his words necessarily. We see the years of polish that the scribes have done to especially the Old Testament, the years of reflection that they put into it. So his words are in there, but saying that he's the author, that's just not how the Bible works, right? It didn't have an author. It's got many people that worked on this body of knowledge, right? And so over the course of 1,000 years, different books are written. And then in kind of like the time of Ezra, they were polished and made into a literary work of art. And the Bible is both God's divine word and man's literary genius, right? Putting these things together. And Ruth falls right here at the same time as Judges. Hard to say who wrote Ruth. Like authorship of Ruth is very difficult, all right? So history. So obviously there's a difference, right? So here's the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible or the Tanakh, whatever word you want to use. There are 24 scrolls, their division. Here's the Old Testament. It's the same information, same words. It's in a different order. There's different divisions for like what is a book versus a scroll. And so like what's some of the history here? So the Bible has a perfectly traceable history. It's the divine word of God, but it's man's work, right? And so we can tell you about the history of the Bible, which is kind of cool. Of course, there's controversies. That's not surprising. But essentially, the Old Testament is written from kind of the time of like 1445 is what this chart says. Fine, I'll take that. Up until Malachi, which they put in as 434 BC. So that's when it's written. And then it's polished over that time. And then it's eventually canonized, right? And then it's all in originally an archaic Hebrew and then a square script Hebrew. There's little translations there. And then they convert it to Greek. So they convert the whole Bible from Hebrew into Greek. And honestly, at that point in history, once it's converted to Greek, they more or less throw away the Hebrew, right? Which fortunately some people preserved it, but they more or less throw away the Hebrew. It was made into the Septuagint, which was done, I believe, in Egypt by the 70. So the 70 did it. Interestingly, if you do the math, it says the 70 consist of 6 scribes, one from each of the 12 tribes, which 6 times 12 is actually 72, not the 70. But they broke into, I think it was 12 different groups, and individually each translated the Hebrew to the Greek. A little bit of this is like, the details are, I'm just telling you the story as best I know the story, right? I'm sure the actual truth is somewhere near, but not exactly that. And they said the 12 lined up perfectly, and therefore you have the Septuagint. They also translated not just the Old Testament, they also translated other books that were written as well, called the Second Temple Writings. And those continued to be linked in with the Old Testament books, called the Apocrypha. And the difference between those and the Old Testament is just there's a lot of wisdom to them. I haven't read them. I really should. I plan to read the Apocrypha books. I just never have. But whenever people talked about the original Old Testament, they would say, and this is the voice of God, right? Like that's how like Jesus would end when he did a reading, right? But they wouldn't do that with the Apocrypha, right? It's like, and here's another good teaching. It's kind of the phrase that they used. Now, at some point, the Jews completely rejected the Septuagint. It happened largely after Christ, because obviously we were wanting to put Jesus with the Old Testament, and the Jews did not want to, right? Oh, here's the Apocrypha word up there. And so the nice thing about that separation is we actually, kind of like how the Septuagint had like 12 separate groups independently doing, we now have 2 independent branches that are both preserving the Old Testament in their own ways. That's actually really nice for us. So Jews don't accept Jesus, that's kind of bad, but they preserve the Old Testament very well. So there's actually some really good news from the Jews for Christians, which is interesting. And then there's going to be some more things that Christians do here. So I think this other website shows it better. Great read if you go to this Bible history and just kind of look at their information. So started in a very archaic Hebrew, which did not have any vowels. Words like Aleph were just the 2 characters, right? Got translated into square script Hebrew. By the way, 2 books, Daniel and Ezra, were actually Aramaic, so they actually never were in Hebrew, which is interesting. And then the Septuagint translated into Greek. And so then such was born the modern language of Greek in moving this forwards. You can see that it's got this OT plus A, so the Old Testament plus the Apocrypha were all in the Septuagint. By the way, there's also a plus L over here. This was another letter of Paul that was lost, the Laodiceans or something like that. Not worried about the L. I just wanted to point that out in case you saw anything. So it included the Old Testament and the Apocrypha. Around the same time, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, which is an interesting group. So this group was essentially monks that lived up in the hills near the Dead Sea. And they had their own copies of all these Hebrew scripts of the Old Testament. And the interesting thing about them is in like 70 AD, the Romans came to kill them all, right? And they knew the Romans were coming to kill them all. There's a history here you could read. And what they did is they didn't mind all dying, which is interesting, but they did mind their scrolls being destroyed. And so they, to the best of their ability, put them in jars, put them in time capsules, and hid them in caves so that their scrolls could be preserved. And we found these scrolls like 50 years ago, which is insane. And so the neat thing about this is we're going to get to compare all this history of the Bible to the Dead Sea Scrolls like 50 years ago, which is awesome, right? So anyway, the Septuagint, continue with this. There were apparently just some errors that were made that got fixed over time. At the same time, we're fixing the Old Testament. This is when the New Testament was written about Jesus. So Jesus spoke Aramaic. He didn't write a single thing, which is crazy that Jesus never wrote a single thing in the Bible. He just spoke, right? Other people wrote about him, and they probably did Aramaic and translated to Greek. Some authors, like Luke, went straight to Greek. Like Luke knew Greek, right? Which is cool. So like we have like the pen strokes essentially of like what Luke wrote in Greek, and people are good at translating it. So I think it's really neat. So a lot of good things about the Old Testament. The New Testament. The Old Testament is now a translation of a translation already. From there we go to Latin. So it exists in Greek for a long time. Greek dies out in favor of the official language, which is Latin. And so we get translations into Latin, the most famous of which is very much Jerome's translation, the Latin Vulgate. I'm sure I'm saying it wrong. Which was given a year of 383. Really, he worked on it for like 30 years, right? That's the year that we put on it. It continues to include the Apocrypha, and he has merged the New Testament and Old Testament side by side, right? So Christianity did not start with Jesus Christ. Christianity started at the beginning of time, right? So like how old is the Christian religion is like the beginning of time, right? And he put them together. And we point this one out because this is actually the version of the Bible that survives for the longest, right? And so it's probably 1,500 years. It's the main Bible. There's some other things here. This line that we'll see in the next slides, like it was eventually converted to English. We did eventually have a printing press where we mass-produced Codex Bibles. There were many versions, including like King James in 1611. And then eventually we learned to speak Hebrew It was a dead language when we brought it back. And we were able to translate original Hebrew scripts, which Messianic text or something like that. And we were able to translate the Dead Scriptures, which is really cool with this history. Now, we immediately see a language problem, right? So translated to a different version of Hebrew, translated to Greek, translated to Latin, which is then translated to English. So Hebrew, Greek, Latin, English. I don't know if you've ever played the telephone game, but we're 5 people in at this point. And the Bible is so nuanced and so important with those nuances that we're like 5 languages in, and it's really a problem. Interestingly, historically, this translation, it is the least of the problems of this time period in history. This time period in history is super messed up. And it leads to the Protestant Reformation. Most famous person in the Protestant Reformation is Martin Luther. It actually started in many places, but Martin Luther is kind of the famous one who started it, just because he existed after the printing press, and so he actually had the tools to get the word out. And he was ostentatious, right? So like he was the big loud leader that people like look at. It's interesting that his namesake, Martin Luther King Jr., tremendous people that made these, I shouldn't say tremendous people, but tremendous influencers in history that made these changes. And they're largely like seen in history because they were the bold ones who like really, like he nailed them to the door, right? And said, hey, there's a problem. The problems were extreme, right? So the problems were the church and state were perfectly merged, right? So the Holy Roman Church was the powerful, government and also the powerful church, and they wanted to keep it that way, right? They liked that the Bible was in Latin. They controlled the Bible. They made laws that you couldn't translate it, right? We are the keepers of the sacred text, and that's the way that it is, right? And the crazy thing is they're the leaders of the church who are supposed to be the hope for all humanity, right? And so some of the things they do are crazy. So I'll just mention the worst, right? So the worst is they invented a concept of purgatory. You've probably heard of purgatory. Purgatory is invented by the Holy Roman Church, right? So some negative things in Catholics past there. They've moved on since then. But purgatory was when you weren't good enough to go to heaven, you weren't bad enough to go to hell, you would go in purgatory, and you would be dead, but you would be floating in purgatory, waiting for one of your descendants to buy your way into heaven, right? And so you had to buy, as an individual, you had to buy an indulgence, and then once you purchased this indulgence from the church, then your parent's soul would be released from purgatory and go into heaven. And it worked. It worked big time, right? Because people believe in God, and then their religious leaders tell them they need to do this, and like money's rolling in, right? And these are the leaders of the hope of the world, right? And so many people were against this. One of them was an English king, but he was against them for another reason. But started to bring down the church. They started to change some of their ways after. And this Reformation takes a lot of time. In fact, this Reformation leads to a group of English Protestants leaving Europe and sailing to America, right? And so we'll talk about them. You know, of course, some of the Pilgrims were these English Protestants, right? One more thing before we leave the slide. The church was so mad when Wycliffe converted the Bible into English that it was finished he died just due to health. He just happened to die, right? He died before they got a chance to punish him. So they burned at the stake all of his associates. And then, this is just funny, 44 years after he was died, they exhumed his body just so they could burn him for translating the Bible into English. They were really, really mad, right? Like, that's the history of people, right? So at any rate, I meant to, that was a backward step. I meant to actually talk about pilgrims. So the Pilgrims, when they were coming over, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which you can read, which is just kind of neat that you can just like click on the internet. It's like, let's go read the Mayflower Compact. And so it's like, here's the text of the Mayflower Compact, like coming over, like, in the name of God, amen, is how it starts. I think that kind of tells you where we're going. We won't bother read I guess I shouldn't say bother, but we won't read all the details. But I'm just saying that it's not surprising that America started off great, right? In fact, you can see traces of this still present today, just because it takes a long time for us to lose it. But our money still says, in God we trust on it. The coins, every dollar bill, they all say this. Now, people are petitioning to get it to remove because, well, America's not Christian anymore, right? And it's on our Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. And that's because our history was Christian, English Protestants, right? That was our history. And whereas that's not really who we are today. Like today, I'm not going to go into this. It feels like we're in Judges sometimes today, right? Like I was like, oh my gosh, what is going on? And we're not about to go into this tangent, but it is not surprising at all that America did well, right? Because this is how we started. And the making America great again is obvious, right? Like we got to go back to who we were, and this is who we were. So, all right, digress. Other things that happened in modern history, just to kind of say, 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Interestingly, they were not discovered by historians. It's not like they went straight to a museum. They were discovered by looters and profiteers, right? There was a gas station guy in Bethlehem that bought them from the profiteers, and he was just selling them on the international market. He was like trying to get big bucks. And when we discovered them in the U.S. was when they took out an ad in the New Yorker trying to sell them. And people went and eventually figured out that it's like, they just assumed he's lying, right? But they discovered this guy was for real. This gas station owner in Bethlehem had this 2,000-year-old copy of the Bible. And I mean, people were freaking out. And the neat thing is that we were able to compare the Bible that we got today, translation, to original 2,000-year-old Hebrew, which we now speak Hebrew. It's no longer a dead language. And you can compare the two. First observation, they were really, really good. Whew! Dodged a bullet there. Like, it's crazy how good they are, to be perfectly honest. The other observation is there's little differences here and there, like subtle things. Like, I should have brought up an example, but you can go look at them. And that shouldn't bother you, right, is the main thing. Because it has both a human history and it's the divine word of God. And you can look at what the little things that are different, and we don't see God-breathed differences in them. And the other crazy thing is this happened in 1947. We're not talking about ancient history. I mean, we ask ages of people in the room, and somebody in the room was born in the 50s, right? Like, this is not that long ago. So it's interesting that we've got this long history of, like, the Wycliffe Bible, the Coverdale Bible, the Great Bible, the King James Bible, and then the Jews have a completely different history with these Masoretic texts, the most famous of which being the Leningrad Codex. And whenever they're different, this is crazy today, whenever they're different, we translate it using the Jewish preserved Hebrew. Isn't that crazy? So really, our Old Testament doesn't actually come from any of this anymore, because whenever they're different, we use this one as the source. So it's really interesting that actually the Old Testament comes from the Jewish preservation of the Hebrew. The only thing that we get from our history, the Christian preservation, is we get the order of the books, so it changed in the Septuagint. We get the divisions of the books, things like 1st and 2nd Samuel versus just Samuel. We get the 12 prophets as individual books instead of just one scroll. And so it's just kind of interesting. And so really, our Old Testament is based on decisions that were made in Egypt in 200, 300 BC. But the original order and intent that Jesus and others read is actually better preserved in the Hebrew Bible. So, like, in my opinion, like, we should have a New Testament still, but we should have a New Testament and a Hebrew Bible. But nobody really asked me these things. Just to be clear, though, it is both the divine work of God, the God-breathed messages. I'm not saying inerrant. I'm saying God-breathed. There's a little difference there if you study the differences. And it is also a great work of human literary art, right? And the artist who made it had it in a certain order, and they crafted it, like in the time of Ezra when they put polish on this Bible. They edited it all together in a certain order. And, like, I mean, I think our goal should really be to preserve the author's intent. And I think that the 24 scrolls do that better, right? Just to be perfectly honest, nobody asked me. If you think you have a better interpretation, that's great. Do that with commentaries. because you definitely need to interpret the Bible some. It's hard to just read straight up, right? And all the truths are in there, but you do need commentary. But you shouldn't, you shouldn't change the order if you can figure out what the original authors meant. A little digress there. Whew, done with that. That was a long tangent. That was a little long one. What we're actually talking about today is Ruth. I got there just to kind of tell you, I got there because the book was moved. And then I lost myself in a 20-minute rant. So today's about Ruth. It's the shortest chapter. I snuck in the rant because I knew it was the shortest chapter. And if we wanted to learn about Ruth, a great way to learn about Ruth is to read it, obviously. It's 4 chapters in the Bible. It's 7 pages in the story. You can also watch these videos. Bible Project just does an amazing job of both summarizing and adding commentary. You should go watch it, right? Marilyn does a nice job. The Official Story Bible does a nice job. Marilyn's is more about how it affects you as a person. So it's more about how crisis can lead to blessing. But you should go watch one of these videos. I'm not going to watch one here, but you should go watch it instead of listening to me, right? They're really good. Whenever I look at these stories, I try to always do timeline, location, characters, authorship. Admittedly, I forgot to include authorship today, but the authorship, it's kind of hard to know who the author is. Honestly, we give authorship to just whoever the nearest prophet was. So Eli, Samuel, like you pick, right? But it's really multiple people that shaped the Bible. So I'm not even going to worry about the author slide today. When was it chronologically? So it was in the time period of Judges. So our best guess is 1375 to 1050 BC. If you look at the other facts, you could probably narrow it a little more. So, for example, it's in Moab, so it was probably after Ehud. So after Ehud makes sense because there was a battle with Moab, so it was probably well after Ehud, is a guess. Maybe it was before Ehud, but probably it was after Ehud. People also try to use the genealogy that's given in Ruth to put a date on it because Ruth was the mother of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of King David. And there are stories that show that Jesse really was the father of David, right? Genuinely the father. But to be honest, genealogies, they skip people, right? And so really we've got 5 men, Solomon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. And we've got 400 years. And so that's a long time, right? So that suggests that each person has a kid when they're 90, and that's a little too big, right? And so the answer is not that everybody has their first kid at 90. The answer is sometimes we leave people out of genealogies. In fact, I won't let us go down this tangent, but you could talk about genealogies in depth, and you could see this in other ways. There are 3 kind of different genealogies in the Bible. One is in Matthew chapter 1. He lists a genealogy from, I think his goes from Abraham to Jesus. There's a genealogy in Luke, I believe it's chapter 3. I used to have it memorized, by the way, just kind of a little fun fact. It goes from Adam to Jesus. It's a big one, right? And it includes a lot more names. And that's the one I had memorized, by the way. I think it's 77 names in there that I could pronounce them all at one point in time. And then there's also genealogies in the Old Testament, such as the one in Ruth. And there's little differences, right? And in fact, from Matthew and Luke, from Zerubbabel to Jesus, there's a lot of differences. And why? How could there be differences? Well, first off, father doesn't necessarily mean direct father the way we interpret it. It means in the line of, right? And so you can actually leave off whoever you want. In fact, if you compare Matthew, which I think it's the Old Testament, he leaves off 4 people that were all evil, right? So he just leaves them off, right? And he was an artist as well, a literary artist, and he had exactly 14 generations from Abraham to David, and then exactly 14 generations from David to the exile in Babylon. And then he had exactly 14 generations from Babylon to Jesus. And I personally prefer that we just do history as best we can and to heck with literary art. But he leaves out some people, right, is really what it comes down to. And one video, which does a really good job of saying this, is from an interesting source. So I'm just going to tell you about this guy, just in case you didn't know about him. So his name's Matt Barker. He runs a website called Useful Charts. And he is one of the leading false prophets of our time, just to say it as bluntly as I can. And the crazy thing is he is getting millions and millions of like subscribers and followers. Like my videos get about like 9 people to watch them, so that's great. His are 9 million, right? And he's a huge conspiracy theorist. But this is crazy. He always bases it on some truth. Like there's always some truth in his stuff, which makes his work really, really harder, right? And he does a really nice job with the organization. I even bought one of his charts and framed it, right? So this is his genealogy of the Bible. I put it in a frame, right? And I'm fully aware that he is a false prophet. He claims to be a Muslim Jew or something like that. And I'm fully aware of what's going on here. But he does a really nice job of displaying things visually. They're called infographics. He does a really nice job of having some truth. And it's fun to watch his videos because just to see if you can find them, right? Like, so in this video, starting at 17 minutes, he's got a really nice description of the genealogies. And then he throws in some ridiculous things as well, right? And it's fun to watch him, but man, you got to be able to find the truth in things. So, all right, little tangent there about genealogies. Little tangent about one useful charts guy, Matt Barker, PhD. And so it's fun if you come across his videos on YouTube, know what to expect, right? Moving on, I'm Mr. Tangent today. Locations. So the locations are, of course, Bethlehem, where they start and where they come back to. They travel to Moab. It doesn't say the route at all in the Bible, but we know the roads, right? So roads went from there to Jerusalem, to Jericho, to the city of Heshbon. There was a good ford right here to cross the Jordan. From there, there was a road where you could come down into Moab. So that's probably the route they took. Honestly, it's only like 40 miles, maybe. A website said 30. You could do it in, 4 or 5 days, or this website said 7 to 10 days. Doesn't matter, right? But that's kind of what we're talking about. This is where they started and where they went to, and then they went back. One thing I'll mention, just before we get in here, is they left the Promised Land, which is kind of interesting because, the prophecies, like going back to Abraham about your descendants will come back to this land and be a blessing to the earth. They left, right? And so it's important when you read the Bible to look at parallels of this story and other stories. And so I went back. I'm sure there's more, but I found 4 times in the Bible, just up to where we've read so far, where people leave the Promised Land specifically due to famine even, and whether they talked to God about it and how it went for them. So the first one, this is the first one that I found, maybe I missed somebody, right, was Abraham. Abraham, there was a famine in the land, and he went to Egypt. And so he was there because the famine was severe. And when he was there, this is one of the 2 times where he lied about Sarah being his sister. She was his sister, but she was also his wife, right? And then that leads to problems. God bails him out. God's pretty good to Abraham at this time in his life. Abraham does come through and shows like complete obedience to God later. But they pick up Hagar during that trip, is most likely based on her name. She was Egyptian. And then with Hagar, that's who they decide to give children to Abraham through the slave. She has Ishmael. It goes badly. And there's no evidence in the Bible in Genesis that God ever spoke to Abraham and said, go to Egypt, right? Like it very much looks like this is something that he chose to do to solve the problem. I mean, this is who he was, right? He was a problem solver. He was bold, right? But it's just interesting to see that he left because of famine without necessarily talking to God, and it went badly for him. Next one that we could find, Isaac. There was a famine in the land, and he did turn to the Lord, and the Lord said, don't go. And he didn't. And that's the end, right? So it's like the most boring story in the world. God said, don't go. He didn't go. God provided for him. He stayed, and it all worked out. Jacob also had a famine in the land. This one's the more famous famine. He turned to God, or God spoke to him in a vision, I guess I should say, and yelled at him, Jacob, Jacob, right? Like, this is important. Don't be afraid to go to Egypt. I'll make your great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you. So obviously, when you get told that, you do go, and it works out, very well in terms of population numbers, bad in terms of slavery numbers. but he seeks God's input on this through prayer. Or, God screamed at him, either way you want to say it. And he followed what God said. Elimelech, this is Naomi's husband, there's no evidence that he turned to God. And so he was solving the problem of the famine. And I'm not saying necessarily that God's hand was against him, but it did go badly for him, right? And so I would say that God probably wasn't with him. He wasn't necessarily against him, but he wasn't with him. And he died, and his 2 sons died. And so it's just kind of, I'm not saying, I'm just saying, right? And so it's just interesting to look at information from the Bible when you're really kind of like meditate and look at it like forwards and backwards. So it's just kind of interesting. So we're talking about Ruth. Ruth has 3 main characters, of course. Hopefully you watched that video and you saw Ruth, Naomi, Boaz. And then Ruth and Boaz have Obed, who in this picture is held by Naomi because Naomi has a son. Her family line is continued, right? And it's fun to look at these perspectives, like the story from Ruth's perspective, the story from Naomi's perspective, the story from Boaz's perspective, the story from like David and Obed's perspective or God's perspective. And that's what we're going to do. That's what we did in the small group a little bit. So we'll just kind of throw out some questions. A small group is a better way to do this because other people answer, who's not me. But because this is a video, I could wait for somebody that's watching to answer. I'm going to be waiting a while. And so I think that it's really important that the first time you read the Bible, which is what we're doing here, you learn, like you go from 0 to something, right? But then if you keep reading the Bible, it's supposed to be meditation literature. You're supposed to go through it numerous times, and you'll find things as you keep going through it. And we can practice this even now. And when you go forwards and backwards through it, you're going to see so many links and so many connections and so many retold stories in different ways that is insane, right? And so, for example, I haven't found this online, but I personally see some similarities between Ruth and Joseph. And so Joseph, if you kind of remember, sold by his brothers in slavery, so really bad things happened to him. And he turns to relationship with God, and then things go well with him. So he goes into Potiphar's house, and he becomes head of the household. Things go badly for him again, accused of going after Potiphar's wife, gets sent to prison, steadfast with God and his right relationship with God, and then things go good for him. And he's a big part of God's story as a result. Ruth, similar. She was from Moab. She had to leave her family to marry this Israelite man. I'm sure that was hard for her, right? Like she had to shun her whole family to marry this Israelite guy. I mean, there's not a good history between these two people groups. And if based on the fact that she follows Naomi, she was probably very happy. Like she had given up everything to marry one of the 2 sons. I don't even remember his names. And she was now a part of this family. And presumably there was a time of joy in her life. I don't really know, but the fact that she stays with Naomi, I would think that there surely was. And then it goes badly, right? Her husband dies. Her husband's brother dies. The brother's father also died before them. Admittedly, my chronological is out of order there. But they all die. And Naomi is moving back home. And like her life just falls apart. Like she had given up everything for this life, and it just falls apart. And instead of downward spiral, wallowing, same as Joseph, she chooses loyalty. Now, Joseph's loyalty was to God, and her loyalty was to Naomi. But there's similarities here, and so it doesn't keep her on the ground forever. She uses hardship, crisis, and stay in response with loyalty, which is really interesting. That's similar to Joseph. Other perspectives that you could look at. What if this book was called Naomi, right? So what if in the Bible, because really it's a story about Naomi, Boaz, and Ruth, right? And then they pick a title for it, just like anything else. What if they'd pick the title Naomi? Well, if this was the story in the Bible called Naomi. If she was the main character, who would she be like? And we asked this to the group, and somebody's answer, I think it was Tracy, she's like, well, she's kind of like us. And she's kind of like us because bad things happen to her, and she goes into depression. She goes through different stages of depression, and she's in anger, right? This is where she's at. She is given grace that she doesn't deserve, to be perfectly honest. She doesn't deserve it. She's not being given a reward because she deserves it. She's given grace. And then she sees that Boaz can be her redeemer to bring her back. And at some point in the story, she switches. So she comes up with a plan, right? And so she knows how things work. There's no way Ruth could have done all these like things with the blanket as symbolic for, hey, I would say yes if you asked me to marry you. But she comes out of it. She comes around, and she is making good choices. And so we can see that and then she's blessed through this whole thing. And so like this is us, right? Is who Naomi is in the story. We can also see things from God's perspective. So God didn't have to give Naomi another chance, right? But God does. That's who God is, right? And so it's really interesting how little they say God's name, but how God is so obviously present in this whole story. If you watch the video, you heard those exact words, right? It's interesting to look at Boaz and think about who Boaz was. So Boaz was clearly a man who followed the Torah. He must have known it well. He must have, loved the Lord his God with all his heart, soul, and strength. He must have kept these commands on his heart. He hopefully talked with them throughout his life. He bound them on his hands, right? Like he was a man of noble character. How do we see that? So if we look at like the laws, like Leviticus, Deuteronomy, it says like when you reap your harvest, don't go to the very edges. Don't go back and get it. Leave it. Leave it for the poor, the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow. And so that way the Lord will bless your hands. And he did this like religiously, I guess is one way to say it, right? And it's also fun. These laws were written by Moses in like 15 BC. And then now we're up to like, I'm just picking a number here, 11 BC. It's like 400 years later. These laws, they're almost describing Naomi and Ruth. They were poor. They had nothing, right? They were a foreigner. Ruth was a foreigner, right? They were fatherless. Elimelech had died. They were a widow. This is like, Ruth and Naomi. Ruth. Probably Naomi was fatherless too. Naomi, right? Like, it's almost like we're pointing at these people when these laws were made, right? And so it's just so interesting. Other things about Boaz. This one is subtle, but really crucial. Boaz, when he prays, he sees Naomi, and he sees her noble character, and he prays that God should bless her. That's kind of weird, right? Why doesn't he say, I'm going to marry her? Like, he says, God bless her. And this is exactly what it says in Luke. So in Luke, it says, the harvest is plentiful. There's plenty of people that don't know God in the world. The workers are few. There's not enough kingdom workers to do the work. And then you would expect the next line to be, therefore, go work the fields. You would totally expect that. Not what it says. It says, ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers. So ask the Lord of the harvest, which is God, right? Ask God to do his will in the earth. And why does it say this? Why doesn't it say you should go? It's because the idea is, as a Christian, you want to see God's will being done. And it doesn't matter to you if you're the pastor that's in front of the people that's saying the word. So like, it doesn't matter if it's you or if it's somebody else. You want God's will to be done on the earth as it is in heaven. Like, that's your goal, right? Now, if you pray this and you pray this earnestly and you believe it, don't be surprised at all if God asks you to be the one to do it, which is what happens in the story. God asked Boaz to be the one to do it. And it's not, God doesn't shout at him. God doesn't say anything at all. But God gently provides opportunities, like the feather's breath of Naomi grabbing the blanket and putting her over. And even then, he doesn't jump at it. He follows the law. He says, hey, I did my research. There's somebody that's closer. We got to ask him first. And if he says yes, that'll be great too. So we're going to ask the Lord to decide. That other guy, by the way, he was never going to say yes because he had to buy the land. No big deal. Happy to have more land. He even does that in the story. But he also had to continue the family line of Elimelech, right? And so he was going to pick up Naomi and Ruth, and he would be required to have a son with one of them. Naomi was too old, so it had to be Ruth, right? So he was required to have a son with Ruth, as was his Redeemer's role, right? And he was married. He had kids. He was not about to marry a Moabite and make sure to have a son with her. And so he declines, which was all part of the plan, God's plan, right? And Boaz, had to check that first, but then he's the Redeemer. And so Boaz in the story plays the role of Jesus. I'm not saying Boaz was Jesus, but he was a man of noble character, and he is the Redeemer who redeems Naomi and helps her have a son. So it's just so interesting. Obed and David's perspective, their genealogy has non-Jews in it, right? So Ruth, not a Jew, she's a Moabite. Rahab, not a Jew, she was in Jericho. They picked her up when she helped the spies in Jericho. You could even go farther back to Tamar. Long story about Tamar with Judah is also part of this line. And so what does this mean to them? What does this mean as we go forwards? And one of the takeaways is that Jesus is not just Jewish, right? Jesus is for all people. And these three women that we see in the genealogy show that, right? So it's not just for Jews, which is kind of interesting. I think we'll probably stop there. I'll show you some of these slides. David Baines from our church, he asked these questions with different words. And asking questions with different words can be really good for you, right? Because really, when you don't understand something in the Bible, because this seems like such a simple story that it's like you finish reading it and you're like, oh, why did I just read that? But if you look at it deeper, you'll search until you find the right questions, and then you'll really understand what the God-breathed message is, which is fun. And so if you remember Judges, asking the right questions, these are not role models. These are tragic literature, right? And if we ask the right questions here, we'll see how God is working through the story, but not actually mentioned, which is kind of crazy. And he does a really nice job of talking about spreading the gospel, and some verses here. He discusses whether God was actually against Naomi or not, and we would argue that he wasn't with them, but he was with them to give them a redeemer and a way back, right? And Boaz answering his own prayer about do something for Naomi, the foreigners in the line of Jesus. So a lot of the same questions we asked, just in different ways. So that's it for this week. Really enjoyed learning about these people that were in the time of Judges, who in the Bible probably should have been a scroll that we read later. But I was delighted personally to read it now, because we've been going through some serious stuff with Judges, and it's not going to stop with Kings, and it's not going to stop with Samuel. Samuel King, sorry, I said that backwards. And so it's just a little break. So I personally would rather we use the 24 scrolls in the order of the Hebrew Bible. But honestly, for this week, I'm kind of glad to get the little break and hear a nice story. All right, that's it for this time. See you next time. Bye.